Hey everyone, in this video you'll learn how to use the FS shooter system asset in Unity to set up shooting mechanics in your game. So we'll create a scene like this from scratch where the player will have to go through different enemies like this, and the enemies will also shoot at the player tactically by taking cover, flanking and all that. So let's look at how to create this. So here I have a project with the shooting system installed. And I've also created an empty scene with just this environment. So let's look at how to set up the shooting system from scratch. So first, I want to create a player character that can shoot. So I'll go to Tools and open up the FS Systems window. And in here, I'll go to Setup. And here I'll select Shooter along with the locomotion. And I'll just change the name of the animator to something like Shooter Controller. And if you want, we can change the character model by dragging and dropping an FBX character into this window. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to use this model for my player. Alright, so let me go ahead and click on Setup, and that should create the player character for us. Okay, and if we just run the game, you can see that the player equips a rifle by default, and we can aim our gun by holding the right click, and we can shoot by left clicking. Alright, we can also use the scope by right clicking twice. Okay, so if you want to change the weapon the player has, then you can just select the player game object and find the fighter core script. So in here we can change the default weapon the player is holding. So if we just click on this, we can see all the guns that are available. Alright, so if you want the player to have the pistol by default, then you can select that. And now if you run the game, the player should have the pistol by default. Alright, so next, we can also give multiple guns to the player, and the player will be able to switch between them. So for that, you can add all the guns that you want to the quick switch items list. Okay, so here we can add any gun that we want. So let's say we want a bazooka by default, and a sniper, and a grenade. So now when we run the game, the player will have the pistol by default, but we'll be able to change it by pressing the caps lock key and choosing the weapon we want. Okay, so if I choose a sniper, you can see that the player equips the sniper. Okay, we can also try using the bazooka. Alright, so similarly you can test all the weapons provided in the asset by default. You can also go ahead and add new weapons. I'll be covering that in the next video. For now, we'll set the scene up with the default weapons. Alright, so up next, let's look at how to add enemies. So again, it's pretty simple. You can just open the FS Systems window, and in Setup, change Player to AI and check Shooter AI. Alright, again, I'll just change this to Shooter Controller. And let me just use a different model for the enemy. So let me just find the model from my project. Alright, and I'll click on Setup. So that should create the enemy for us. Okay, so in Unity, for the enemy to be able to move, we have to bake a nav mesh, right? So I'll just add a nav mesh surface component to our, environment game object, and then I'll bake the nav mesh. Okay, so this should create a nav mesh like this in our scene that will allow our AI characters to move around the scene. Okay, so now if we test the game, we should be able to shoot the enemy, and the enemy will also shoot back. Alright, so this is the basic setup. But here, one thing I want to improve is, right now, when we shoot at the enemy is getting hit on his capsule collider. So that won't be very accurate. We'll be able to shoot over here and the enemy will still take hit, right? So we should only be able to shoot on the body parts of the enemy. So to do that, we can set up colliders on all the body parts of the enemy. So we have also created an editor to simplify this process. So let me go and open the shooter prefab and collision setup window. And from here, I'll select Ragdoll and collision. So adding colliders to the body parts of the character can be useful for both taking damage and also for Ragdoll. Okay, so here for the target animator, I'll just drag and drop the enemy model. So this is the model on which the animator is attached. And then I'll click on create Ragdoll. So this will create the colliders for us. And next I'll click on apply damage detection setup. So doing that will allow us to shoot on the body parts of the enemy. Alright, so if we look at our enemy, you can see that multiple colliders are attached on him. And we can adjust the size of the collider if we want. So I'll just expand the skeleton of the enemy. And here, if we look at the collider for the spine, it needs to be a bit more higher. So I'll just click on the edit collider and I'll make it a bit more higher. Alright. And next we can increase the size of the collider attached on the head. So I'll find the head bone, and here we can just increase the radius a bit. I'll change it to something like 0.12, and I'll just adjust its Y position a bit. Okay, so that looks fine. And by the way, if we look at all the body part, you can see that there's a script called shooter bone damage handler attached to it. So this is a script that allows us to shoot and damage that body part. So here we have something called damage multiplier. So in most games, if you shoot the enemy on the head, the damage will be much more higher, right? You can mostly kill the enemy in one shot if you shoot on the head. So if you want to set that up, you can just increase the damage multiplier. So if it's 10, that means the damage by that hit will be multiplied by 10 times. Okay. So next we can also set up the bone colliders for the player. So right now the player only has a capsule collider. So again, I'll open up the shooter system setup window, and in here I'll drag and drop the player game object, and I'll create Ragdoll and apply damage detection setup. Okay, so that will create the colliders on the body parts of the player. Again, let me adjust the spine and the head bone. So I'll go to the spine game object, and from here I'll click on edit collider and I'll bring this up a bit. Okay, next let me find the head game object, and I'll just increase the radius here, and let me adjust its Y position a bit. Alright, so now since we have colliders on the body parts of the player and the enemy, we don't want to hit their capsule collider when we shoot. right? So for that, what we can do is on the FS player game object, we have a script called shooter settings. And in here, we can define a hit ignore mask. So here we can give both player and enemy. And that means we won't hit the player and enemy directly on their capsule glider. Okay. The bone has a different layer. It's not player or the enemy. So we will hit the bone, but we won't hit the capsule collider directly. All right. So let's try testing this. So we can try shooting the enemy on the head, and you can see that the enemy was killed with just one shot. All right. And next, if I shoot somewhere else, like on the body, then it takes much more hits to kill the enemy. Okay. So we have set up bone collision for both player and the enemy. And now if you want to create more enemies, you can just duplicate this one so that you won't have to do things like bone setup and all that again. Okay. But every time you create an enemy character with a new model, you'll have to create them and attach the colliders. All right. So next, let's take a closer look at the weapons so that you'll understand how to tweak their damage, speed, and all that. So you can find the weapons inside the shooter systems folder, inside game, and weapon folder. Alright, so these are our weapons. We have two types of weapon here, shooter weapon and a throwable weapon for weapons like grenades and all that. So if I select a weapon like pistol, you can tweak things like the fire frequency, magazine size, projectile speed, damage, and all that from here. So if you look at different guns, they'll have different values. You can tweak it based on the requirements of your game. So here you might notice that the damage is 0. The reason for that is because we are defining the damage in the ammo. So if you open the weapon settings, here you can see a reference to the ammo that this gun uses. And if you select the ammo, you can see that we can define the damage over here. Okay, so we can define damage for both weapon and ammo, and the total damage inflicted will be a sum of both. So for most cases, you just have to specify the damage in just one place. The reason why we gave separate damages for weapon and ammo is because in case you want to use two different types of ammos for a single weapon. So for example, you might have a bow and you might have different arrows with different damage. So in that cases, you can use both the damage in the ammo and the damage in the weapon. Okay, so back in our weapons folder, here you have lots of settings. So they're pretty much self-explanatory and they have a tooltip when you hover over them. So spend some time and go through these settings so that you'll be able to tweak things for your game. All right. We'll also look more deeply into this when we create our own weapons in future videos. So up next, let's look at how to add covers. So cover system is one of the main features of this asset, and it's pretty straightforward to use it. So here inside the shooter system folder, I'll go inside prefabs. Actually, the prefab for cover is inside the cover system folder. We just separated this in case we want to use the cover system separately without using the shooter. So yeah, inside the cover system folder, inside prefab, here we have a cube that can be used as a cover. So it's just a basic cube. The only difference is inside it, there are two colliders. All right, there are two box colliders. Those are triggers, and their layer should be cover. So right now it's ledge because in this project the order of the layers are different. So I'll just change it to cover. So these two cubes allow the enemy to detect cover points and it'll make the enemy take cover. Alright, so you can change the model of this cube to any other model you want. The only thing is inside it you need two box gliders like this with the layer set to cover. Alright, so let me duplicate this and create another cover somewhere over here, and I'll just disable one of the enemies so that we can focus on just one, and I'll place the other one over here. Okay, and let me just name this as FS shooter enemy to make things more clear. Alright, let me just adjust the positions of the cover. And by the way, when we add objects like these to the scene, we also have to bake the nav mesh again, otherwise the enemy will be able to pass through them. Okay, so let's try testing this. So if I go near the cover and press G, then the player will take cover, and after shooting for some time the enemy will also try to take cover and the enemy will try to shoot us from the cover. Alright, and if the player stays in the cover for too long, then one of the enemies will try to flank the player by coming forward and trying to find the player. Okay. So you can find the settings related to flanking in the shooter AI manager script. So the script manages all the AI that are currently fighting the player, and here we have an option called shoot flank. You can turn it off if your game doesn't need flanking, and then time to start flanking is the time that the player has to stay in cover for one of the enemy to start flanking. Okay, so this is the overall setting for flanking. And then there are settings that you can control individually for each enemy. So if you select the enemy game object, here in the shooter AI controller, you can find all the individual settings for the enemy. So here you can define a time range for shooting. So this will be the time for which the enemy will shoot before trying to go to the cover state. Similarly, we can also define a time range for cover. So this will be the time for which the enemy will stay in cover before trying to shoot again. And then we also have lots of other settings here, like the shoot movement speed, which is the speed at which the enemy should move while shooting. And we also have a cover approach speed, which is the speed at which the enemy should approach the cover. And then we have three weights: distance weight, distance to target weight, and occupant weight. So these weights are used to determine which cover the enemy should choose. So it's based on three parameters: distance, which is the distance between that cover and the enemy. So the enemy should try to find a cover that is closer to him. And distance to target is the distance between the cover and the target. So again, enemy should try to find a cover that is close to the target so that he can shoot from there. And occupant weight is like if there are multiple other enemies taking cover at the same place, then the enemy should try to avoid it. So by changing these weight, you can define the importance of each factor. So for example, let's say if you want the enemy to always choose a cover that is close to the player, then you can increase this. Or instead, if you want the enemy to always take a cover that is closest to the enemy, then you can increase this. Okay, so just try playing with these values and try to find a good balance. All right, so up next, let's try adding more enemies. So I'll just duplicate this enemy and I'll name the first one as FS Shooter Enemy 1 and the second one as FS Shooter Enemy 2. Okay, and let me just place the second enemy on top over here. Alright, and I'll make him face like this. And here you can see a green spear around the enemy. So this is the vision range of the enemy. That means the range that the enemy can see. So for enemies that are placed at higher points, we might want to increase it, otherwise they won't be able to see the player. Right. So to increase the vision range, I'll expand the enemy and I'll select the vision sensor, and this spear collider is the vision sensor of the enemy. So we can try increasing its radius. I'll set it to something like 15. Okay. And the next thing I want to do is I'll select the enemy and I'll go to the shoot state, and here I'll turn off can cover. Alright. The reason for that is because if the can cover is true, then this enemy will try to come down and take cover over here. So we don't want that. I want the enemy to stay at the top and shoot from there. And we can even change the weapon of the enemy and give him something like a sniper because he's shooting from a long range. Alright. And let's try testing this. So yeah, you can see that the enemy is shooting at us with the sniper. And since the sniper can inflict much more damage, it'll kill us in a few hits. Okay. So next, if we want, we can set a movement range for our enemies. So in most games, the enemies that have a sniper will not move around. They'll usually stay at one place and shoot from there, right? So if you want to create enemies like that, you can set a movement range for them. So here I'll select the enemy and I'll find the combat AI controller script. And in here, we can check has movement range. So this blue circle shows the movement range of the enemy, and we can reduce it, and the enemy will only move in that movement range. Okay. So for this enemy with sniper, I don't want the enemy to move at all, so I'll make the movement range really small, something like 0.1. Okay. So now the enemy should stay at the same place and shoot from there. So let's try testing it. Alright, so that is working fine. So up next, let's try adding enemies that can patrol around our level. So I'll just duplicate this enemy and I'll create enemy 3. Okay, let me just place him somewhere over here, and I want him to patrol through this bridge. Okay, so to make an enemy patrol, we need to create waypoints, which is just a list of transforms. So this asset comes with a waypoint prefab. So let me search for that. So this is the prefab I want, and let me place it over here. Okay, so this is just a list of transform, and we just have a parent game object with a script that will visualize the waypoint for us, and we can use this to define how the enemy should move. Okay, so I just place the first waypoint somewhere over here, and then I'll select the second waypoint and place it over here. And I'll select the third point and place it here. And then we can add or remove more waypoints we want. So let's say I want a fourth waypoint. So I'll duplicate the third one and I'll place it over here. Okay. So we have defined the waypoints. So next we have to assign these waypoints to our enemy so that the enemy can patrol through it. So to do that, I'll select my enemy and to the enemy game object, I'll add a new script called patrol settings. Alright. And here we have a field called patrol waypoints. So I'll assign our waypoints game object to it. Alright. So if a waypoints game object is specified in the patrol waypoints field, then during the idle state, the enemy will patrol through these waypoints instead of just standing still. So let's try testing it. Alright. So you can see that the enemy is patrolling around the level. Okay. So that is working fine. So up next, let's look at how to create interesting moments in game by authoring the enemy's behavior. So what I want to do is, when the player reaches at this point in the level, I want enemies to run and stand on this bridge. Okay. And in this bridge, there will be barrels that the player can explode by shooting. So you see these types of moments a lot in shooter games. So let's try creating that. So here, I'll just disable all our other enemies so that we can reach here without being killed by these enemies. And first, let's try setting up the barrels that can explode. So the asset comes with a prefab for barrels. So let me search for barrel and yeah, we do have it over here. Okay. So to make a game object explode, you just have to add these two scripts to it, explosive barrel and damageable scripts. So you can add this to any game object. You don't have to always use this same prefab, right? You can just copy this script and add it to any game object you want. Okay. So let me just place two barrels over here. I'll place it towards here. All right. And now if we shoot at the barrel, it should explode. So let's try that. Okay. Let me equip something like a sniper so that we can zoom and shoot. All right. So yeah, that is working fine. So next we have to order enemy behavior so that enemies will run and come onto the bridge. So let me create different enemies for this. So I'll just duplicate the enemy 1 that we have and I'll change its name to enemy 4. Okay, and let me enable it and place it somewhere over here. All right. And then I'll duplicate this enemy and I'll create enemy 5. Okay, and I'll place him over here. And let me also create another enemy. All right. So I want these enemies to run onto the bridge when the player passes a certain point. Okay. So for that, what we can do is we can use a script called trigger ordered AI behavior. So the asset comes with a prefab with that script attached. So I'll just search for trigger ordered behavior and this is the prefab we want. So let me drag and drop it into our scene. Okay, so it's just a simple trigger with another script attached to it. So in this script, we have to specify the AI characters for which we want to trigger the behavior. So in our case, we want to trigger the behavior for these three enemies. So I'll assign them over here. All right. And now we also have to define these behavior, right? So in our case, the behavior is the enemy running towards this barrel and then shooting at the player. All right. So to define such an AI behavior, what we can do is we can select the enemy and add a script called AI behavior to it. Okay. So this can be used to create complex behaviors with animation, dialogues, and all that. But in our case, we just want the AI to move to a specific position. So we can just use the move node. And here we have to specify the target transform to which the AI should move to. Okay. So for that, I'll just duplicate our waypoints game object. I'll just call this enemy run point for clarity. And here we just need a single waypoint. So I'll just delete the others. All right. And I'll just move this to somewhere over here. Okay. So this is the point to which we want the enemy to run to. So I'll select the enemy and in the AI behavior, I'll just assign this point. Okay. So now I'll duplicate the enemy run point so that we can create separate run points for the other enemies. Okay, so one I'll place over here and I'll create another duplicate and place it over here. So let me assign it to the other two enemies. So first we have to add the AI behavior script and then I'll add the move node and then I'll assign the run point. Okay, we also have to do it for the sixth enemy. So let me go ahead and do it real quick. Okay, so one thing you have to notice that here the blackboard key has to be authored behavior. Okay, here you can also define this behavior as intro behavior or idle override behavior, but author behavior is what we need in this case since we are triggering the authored behavior from here. Okay, so let's try testing this and see if it works. So once a player enters the trigger, the enemies will run towards a point that we set and they'll try to shoot at us. Okay, so since they're near a barrel, we can shoot the barrel and it'll explode. So all our enemies were flown away by the explosion. Okay, uh, the other two will be on the top, I guess. So yeah, they are over here. And by the way, you can control the force of the explosion and all that. So if you select the barrel, here we have a reference to the ammo that is causing the explosion. So if you select that, you can change things like the damage and the explosion force and all that from here. All right. So all these fields have tooltips on them. So try playing with them and find a good balance for your game. You can also learn more about using these systems by looking at the demo scenes. So if you look at this authored behavior demo scene, I have set up multiple enemies here, and everything is organized properly from triggers and barrels, covers, enemies, waypoints, and all that. And there's also a main demo scene in which you can try out all the weapons. So yeah, look at those demo scenes and learn how they are set up. Alright, so this is it for the Kickstart tutorial. I'll be doing another tutorial that will show you how you can create your own weapons and all that. Since this is the Quickstart tutorial, I want to keep it as simple as possible. Alright, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.